Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead. Welcome to episode 131, Why You Need an Orcid ID. I do have slides for this episode, which I will share for those of you that are watching it on YouTube. And if you're listening, I'll describe what it is that we're looking at. It's mostly a couple screenshots. So for this one, you probably could get by audio only, but if you want to check it out, we have it posted on YouTube. I wrote an article very recently, maybe a couple of weeks ago from when this episode is being released, for Inside Higher Ed. I do columns for them occasionally, and I recently wrote one on helping faculty increase their research impact. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But essentially what I talk about in this article is that faculty don't spend a lot of time working on increasing their research impact in most cases. And that's partially because we're so busy creating the things that gives us research impact that we don't necessarily take the time to do other things to kind of cultivate that. So for example, a lot of new faculty that I work with, it's kind of surprising, but there are many that don't have things like a Google Scholar profile, or they don't have their own website, or they don't really talk about the research in any way. A few of them might be on ResearchGate or Academia EDU, and I know certainly lots of platforms have lots of problems, so I'm not promoting a particular one in this case. But I just find that a lot of folks don't take the time to do the scholarly labor to kind of make sure that they are cultivating research impact. And so that was the focus of this article. So not a focus of this episode, but why I bring it up is because I talk about University of Michigan has a research impact challenge, which is really kind of cool. It is an online challenge that you can do yourself. I think I may have even done an episode about this. I will link to it in the show notes if so. But one of the very first steps is to create an Orcid ID. And why that's a first step is because it is something that doesn't take very long to do. But once you have it, you could hook it to all your future publications. So if you're not familiar of what this is, it basically is a unique identifier to you as a researcher that hooks all the research to you. And more researchers are using this so that way there's not a mix-up in who is getting associated with research in terms of databases and things like that. But it's useful in all kinds of other ways. So today I want to talk about some reasons why, if you have been ignoring the whole Orcid ID train, why you might want to get on board. And it's because of some developments with Orcid ID itself. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. So I came up with the topic for this podcast after I read a recent Scholarly Kitchen episode, which I will also link to in the show notes, about some of the changes with Orcid. It's really only been around for about 5 years in the most current version, and it's actually a conglomeration of a couple of different groups that were doing stuff with unique identifiers and research. And so Orcid has become the standard here. And so many institutions encourage their faculty or their graduate students to apply for an Orcid ID and have that associated with their own research. So what I decided to do for this particular episode, once I read the Scholarly Kitchen article, is just to go and open mine up again and just see. Because when I first created it, which was probably maybe 2 years ago, and I might even have an episode on me creating it, it didn't have all the features that it has in the dashboard behind Orcid now. But now I can put in things like my biography, my employment activities, my education, and so on. So when I looked myself up, I was able to see, okay, there's my academic position. It's there. Sections that I'm showing on screen right now that have the little pencil to edit. A lot of these are empty. So like I don't have a biography written about myself, which I didn't know that I didn't put one in. My website, things like that are just not in here. So when I looked at it, so, maybe this is a lesson for people that have already created one of these. Maybe when you created it 5 years ago, you only filled out the sections they gave you in the template, which is, I know what I did because I would have filled out all the sections. So there are a lot more than were there when I first went to create it. So getting in there, it's kind of the same idea as something like Academia EDU, ResearchGate, Google Scholar, any of those places where you can put in your publications, your research, and so on. But it does allow a little bit more of an academic biography here where you can write a paragraph about yourself. You can also, in some other sections, you can link to things like being a visiting scholar somewhere or invited lecturer somewhere. and you can actually have the other institutions hosting you put this in for you. So basically they're authenticating that you were a scholar there. So for example, I mentioned, I think in a recent episode, that I am on sabbatical in 2024, and just for the spring semester of 2024, and I will be at Ohio State as a visiting scholar in project narrative, which is an area in the English department working on narrative theory and projects that work with narrative theory. And so for me, I could reach out to Ohio State and say, hey, can you put in that I'm doing this activity at your institution? So I'm still looking at how to actually invite somebody to do that, but I see why I would want to, because if they are the ones that put it in, it's noted in your Orcid ID profile that they're basically confirming that you were a scholar and working there. So there's a lot of really cool things about what that means, but it's another way to reinforce academic credentials for sure. So here are some things that when I went in, I just started fussing with and fixing on the screen. So one was I started adding in education and qualifications. So I started adding degrees and dates because I didn't have that before. I did not yet put in anything about Defend, Publish, and Lead, since I've owned the company for almost 2 years now. And before that, I was a writing coach under the past president and owner, Dr. Beth Hewitt. So I know that that's something I will want to put in employment, but I know I have to kind of figure out how I want to do that. So that will be something else I add. And then you can also put in things like keywords, which is really cool, and I don't think was in there before. So I was able to put in all my keywords like faculty writing and scholarly publishing. And I just realized, looking at it right now, I really need one on scholarly productivity, since that's what this podcast is all about. But I started putting in my keywords, including my secondary area where I work in classical rhetoric for a course that I teach. So those are some of the things that I just started doing on a second pass. And now if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I kind of need an Orcid profile, these would be all categories. I would fill them all out, because I think you can skip them and they just don't show up on your profile. That's what mine looks like right now. But I think it would be worth putting all the information in here and using this sort of as a de facto CV, because not only does it give us the Orcid ID, which is the number associated with all your research and things like that, but it's associated with you as a researcher. And that would be, I think, another way where this is going to be the identifier that might trail you as a researcher for the rest of your academic career. The more complete and correct this profile is, it probably matters a little bit more than on some of the platforms maybe you don't use quite as often. So here is the rationale, though, why I think it's more important now than ever. I mentioned that Scholarly Kitchen article, and it was just basically about what has happened with Orcid in the last 5 years and where it might be going in 5 years. But one of the things that it has in this article is a link to Orcid's vision for what it's going to do. I shouldn't say Orcid's vision. I should say the organization behind Orcid and what the vision is for this. But certainly there is a push to encourage more researchers to get Orcid IDs. And to do that, the system has also developed data visualization tools that I think are going to be very appealing to universities within the next 2 to 5 years. Because one of the things that a university can do is it can look at itself and all the researchers that are contributing researchers under their academic affiliation. And if they have Orcid IDs, it can get a good sense of where are our scholars publishing, how many publications does each scholar have, and things like that. It shows impact, for example. So what's the potential impact if we can look at, okay, we've got this cluster of 9 scholars that are all starting to put out research about mental challenges for college students during the pandemic. It can identify research areas it has strengths in, and that might be across disciplines. So maybe a creative writer in my department might be writing some poetry about something like that. We might then have somebody in the health professions that's studying, maybe interventions in schools or something like that. And then maybe, there's somebody that's a cognitive scientist that's working on it. So it's going to allow, and this particular tool is one of the only ones I've seen do anything like this, is basically going to allow this big visualization of how an institution is finding what research their faculty are doing. Some institutions have a way for faculty to kind of self-report, but from the institutional work that we do as Defend, Publish, and Lead, this is something that many institutions no longer have the support staff for, and many of them have they don't have a mechanism any stronger than something like a Google form that everybody fills out once a year. So this would be a little bit more robust, and I could see where this would be appealing to universities looking to do something like this. The other thing that will be important here is how much collaboration might be going on. So for universities looking to kind of pool resources and maybe see where there's strengths across departments, this would be another way that they could do that. So I just think there's going to be a lot of appeal to universities to using this. And if you don't have an ORCID ID, it's very clear what happens. Essentially, you don't show up on the data visualization because they can't find you. So, for many of us that are trying to argue for resources or we want to do different things at our institutions, I know for me, one thing I checked out on my profile is I saw only about 2/3 of my publications are showing up. Why that is, I don't know. I think some of them are easier to add to your ORCID profile than others. I honestly don't remember how I did that in the first place, but I know a few of the ones that aren't showing up are in digital journals that are a little bit newer. And in my discipline of rhetoric and writing studies, they're very, acceptable journals. They're peer reviewed, especially in a sub area I used to work in computers and writing. They were the major flagship journals. But, this is another area. If you're somebody that's a digital scholar, you might want to think about adding all these publications in that maybe are not showing up elsewhere. So at least they're getting attached to you as a researcher. So I think there's a lot to think about there. But when I created an ORCID ID back in the day when I did it, I know it was under 15 minutes for me to do it. With all these categories, I don't want to lie and say you could knock this out in 15 minutes. I don't think you can. But do I think you could totally fill out all the sections within an hour? I think so. I mean, unless you're a very robust scholar and you have hundreds and hundreds of publications, that might take longer, mainly because you're going to be like browsing and attaching for these publications and you're going to be putting them on your profile. But for somebody that's, maybe mid-career or, even if you're a newer scholar just starting out, creating this should not take very long. And I'd highly encourage you to do it. Once you have it, many of the journals will ask for an ORCID ID at the point of article submission. I'm starting to see that more and more. I've also put it on my website where when somebody tries to look at my publications, that's the first thing they see is my ORCID ID. And I know that there'll be other places I'm going to start leaving it or having it available. So for example, should I decide to change academic positions, I know my next CV will have an ORCID ID on there, just so that way I'm able to kind of connect the research to my profile. So hopefully this helps. And if you're looking for help in developing a scholarly profile, you certainly can come back and work with us. We did a webinar a while back on having a strong web presence and a digital media presence. If that's something that you're interested in revisiting, we did it as a free webinar. So if that's something you're looking to get feedback on, you certainly can come to us. Or if you just want a copy of the webinar, let me know. You can always reach me at Christine at Defend and Publish. And happy writing this week.